Hello, YouTube friends. It's been a while again, and I've said all I want to say on YouTube almost. So I'll just do a brief, I think it'll be a brief update on my thoughts. What I think we're going through extraordinary times in many different ways, and even ways most of us don't really understand, other than the fact that we know it's very exciting in the sense of impactful, an impactful time. And this is my random and spontaneous insight by the artist from the studio. Maybe not so random. I've been thinking about certain things, and it's my shock market analysis. The shock market. We are in a shock market situation. Everything is shock oriented, whether it's tremendous losses that people are going through. I just spoke to a friend, a fellow that helps me with computer stuff when I have an issue, and he said he's feeling quite desperate because he's lost so much money in the market. So it's a shock market. But more importantly for me, I'm kind of understanding things about, I suppose, what I would call the bigger picture in the shock market. And what really struck me about everything that's going on is how coordinated the efforts have become within the big picture, meaning we live we live somewhere that appears to have many different countries, and I've visited many different countries, so they exist, and how these different countries appear to be completely coordinated on all the efforts. And there was a time, I think about 30 years ago, or whatever, when Daddy Bush made a famous speech about a new world order. And it appears to me that this order actually exists, considering how much the same all the responses and actions are in countries on the other side of the earth. Like on the, it's like in Australia, they're doing the same thing as they are in Canada or the US or Mexico, wherever. Everything seems to be coordinated, which indicates to me this shock market has completely congealed into one response. It's almost like everyone feels the same way, which is unusual because as a painter, it used to be, or what I understood, especially when I was in art school, and we were learning, but there was still an incredible amount of individuality among the people that were doing this activity, the art activity. But this has become virtually homogenized, that if you go into any museum on earth now, the shows, the work that is presented is really very much the same. And the usual suspects for me are the installation stuff, which is always the sticks and feathers lying on the floor, are from Melbourne to Hong Kong to Shanghai, even to maybe other African countries that normally don't even have art exhibited in museums. All these exhibits look the same. Where did that come from? Why is everything looking so much the same? And any kind of difference or any kind of um, expression that is not within some version of the whatever that is, that controlled message that is being presented to us through the art, it's pathetic. It's terrible. It's like I'd rather see really crap art that looks different from, okay, I have my opinions about what is a decent, good work of art, and there is a lot of good work going on out there, but we don't see it because you have to be within a framework of expressing yourself if you're considered to be of value or interest to these brilliant curators, these brilliant minds that determine what is good and what is bad. So it's all looking the same, whether you're in a small hick town or whether you're in a metropolitan center, this local regional museum that we have here called the Judith and Norman Judith and Norman Alix Gallery in Sarnia, they look exactly the same. It's like a hick town. It's a small town, but they have a museum. Cost a lot of money to build this place. And just as an aside, I always, as a painter, artist, I always advocated. They asked artists' advice, and I said, set aside, like a lot of the European countries, set aside an acquisition fund so that you support not just local artists, but artists in general, that you acquire work, and you have to have a fund. So I think it cost them like 12 or 13 million dollars to build this place, renovate a place, and they have zero acquisition fund. So, and I think in Spain they made a government rule. The government made an ordinance saying that if you run a public institution like they had their cajas or their banking system, they had to set aside, I think, as much as 5 or 10% even in their budgets toward cultural activities. Well, here in Canada, they spent 12 or 13 million dollars and they have zero acquisition funds. So it was just a thought I had in terms of presenting this. They had committees and suggestion committees, and of course this is not interesting to have an acquisition fund and pay artists for work that they do. If they acquire, they rely on donors primarily, and that's a whole other story, the donor kind of stuff that's going on, which is a racket as well, because the people that donate art really don't care about the art. They care about collecting money because they get huge tax write-offs when they donate. That's a terrific story to go into, but it's not of interest to me. I'm interested in the shock market reality and my analysis of the shock market that we're now in with this condition. So the word is out, and this is on the virus, the crown virus that is now going on. And what I found interesting, and this has to do with vaccination. So people were being scorned and looked down upon if you're not getting a vaccination. And in fact, if you're a certain kind of worker, or even in schools, children are not allowed to attend class if they don't have the vaccination. And I thought to myself, this was something that made perfect sense to me, that if you have the vaccination and you are critical of people that do not have the vaccination, you in fact are protected, and those people that don't have the vaccination, as much as they may be carriers of something that you want to prevent from happening, that if you are so clued in to the meaning of the universe on how things are, how you actually are able to combat all those vicious entities, life forms trying to enter our body, which is another, it's called, what is it called? Infectious theory. The point is that it's a theory. This is something that people base their worldview on, a theory, that something exists because it's a theory. Well, a theory is just something that you come up with, an explanation that may or may not be true. So anyway, these infectious theory people have decided vaccinations are essential, but fine, go get your vaccination. And the people that don't are the ones that are at risk. So it's their choice. Well, this has changed drastically now with this new crown virus, because you are the evildoer. Apparently, this is a reinfectious one. You may have it and get over it and then get reinfected, and there is no vaccine for it at this point until they get the vaccine. So no matter what, we are the carbon breathing, the CO2 breathing entities, the toxic entities on this planet that will infect everyone. It's a rather curious position in that you will always be the culprit. No matter what, you're alive, you're the culprit. This is for me, the overwhelming message that we toxic breathing creatures, CO2 creatures, have now become the carrier of a virulent, virtually unassailable attack dog of a virus that is going to decimate everybody unless you behave in a certain way. That's what we've been told. And this is being told everywhere. This is not just in the Western world, Eastern world, Northern world. This is everywhere. This is across the board, equilibrium. Everybody's on board. And that suggests, this gives me the EBGBs, because what has happened is the homogenization of response. And the response is towards human beings who are now the toxic creatures walking around on this planet, threatening to kill everything. So we are in a shock market. We are existing in an extreme environment, not from the point of view of viruses, but from the point of view of response, and the irrational response, the level of irrational response that is being considered to be normal. And the only reason I say it's not normal, it's because it's homogenous. This is why I know there's something wrong here, because you always have a difference of opinion. People have their proclivities, their abilities, their vices, their virtues. There is a range of responses. There's a range of expression, like I said, in the art, that is no longer there. There is no longer, as we become more and more inundated with information from everywhere and everything. And you know how I feel about information. This is really quite insidious, which is why I've stopped posting, because I don't want to contribute to this information glut that is plugging up the intestines of our beings, the intestines of our souls, the intestine. It's like that. We have to excrete this stuff. When it comes in, you got to figure out a way to get rid of it, and people have no way of exorcising or excreting this humongous amount of information being presented to us. It's like our information intestines are clogged up, and we need an enema. We need an information enema of some kind, or some counteraction to this, to what's going on, because we're now completely. This is how it appears to me. We are completely homogenized in our responses and actions. And this is the extraordinary time I feel. Wherever there was the descent part of our nature has been radically reduced to virtually non-existent. And that, of course, that's frightening, because we have historical events that show when this happens, you enter a period of extreme tyranny and brutality, like the Nazi system, or the Mussolinis, or the Mao Zedong's, Pol Pot's. When you have this level of when it becomes ingrained in the popular mind, in the public mind, that dissent can only be considered as a detriment to our existence. This is when we have become susceptible to the worst of the worst that could happen to us. The virus isn't the worst thing. If whatever part of this is true, yes, people get sick all the time. But whatever part of this is true is minimal to what it is affecting us on the level that it is affecting us in terms of our interaction as human beings with each other. Like I always say, the highest part of us is our conscience. There are levels of being within each human that can raise itself to higher levels. And one of this highest level of acting and being is within a conscience. And a conscience, as I've always maintained, is the most objective aspect to us. Okay, it's subjective, obviously, in the way we act, but when you look at morality, or you look at all the structures, the rules and regulations around being, conscience is independent of this. It exists in spite of. So you can have your commandments, your 10 or 12 or 15 or 2, whatever your commandments are. These change with social attitudes. It's like a moral attitude is an attitude that can easily change from one generation to another. But conscience does not. When you are aware of doing the right thing, and when you know you've done the wrong thing, conscience is self-correcting. This is the beauty of this aspect to us. It's ingrained. It's something that is, it's just there, and you can make it complex and difficult, and it can be, sometimes it can be very subtle. Certain aspects of our existence can become very subtle, and you have philosophers dancing on a pin, figuring out the subtleties. But fundamentally, we know when we're doing the right thing or not. So I like this idea of a shock market analysis, that we're in extraordinary times because everything, like, this goes back to the Agenda 21 with Maurice Strong, the strong man who was in charge of making everything homogenous through the United Nations thing. If you check out Agenda 21, it's now Agenda 28 or 31 or whatever it is. This is a continuing effort to homogenize behavior among all human beings. And what I always considered to be the last bastion of defense against this conformity was art. But even art now has become so conformist, has become so compliant with a system that is fundamentally, it's based on fear, shock, aggression, violence. Outside of that, it's just decoration. You have like pretty flowers and stuff. And the only art that really makes a difference to anyone is that when you get clubbed over the head, how many dead bodies can you see lying around you? And even in a metaphorical sense, I'm seeing the expression in people. You have to shock. You have to be part of, you have to somehow be of a spectacle nature in order to create an impact. You have to be part of the shock market. And if you're not, if you're actually expressing something within yourself that is of a higher self, it is generally ignored. It's not desirable. So anyway, I thought I'd chime in because a lot of people are commenting on the dubious nature behind the shutting down of society. In my opinion, I believe this will be one of the greatest wealth extractions ever perpetrated since the invention of money. These lockdowns and the number of people, let's see if it goes further than 2 weeks. My suspicion will be that it will be continued in some version or other. Once you have, it's like a tax. During the First World War, just before, taxation was invented, as far as I understand, and it was supposed to be eliminated after the war, but once it's in place, it just continued. So we still, one of the biggest wealth extractions is through taxation. And I'm not averse to paying user fees on something, but taxation is a completely different formula. User fees are not taxation. So that's how I see it anyway. And once you have a tax in place, like a wealth extraction, it will continue. It will not be removed. So in the same way, these ordinances, these new rules that are being tested are now going to be continued, I believe, in some version or other, even after the so-called 14 or 15-day compliance period. What happens after that, we'll see. It may be ratcheted up, that the numbers on this event, the virus event, will become higher, but for some reason, their test kits were flawed. So how would they know the numbers? Never Lose Truth or whatever her name is. I listened to part of her thing, and apparently, if this is true, the test kits are flawed. So how are they getting the numbers on the true nature of this outbreak? How are they determining that? I'm really curious about that. I'm not saying people are not afflicted. Like every year, I think worldwide over 700,000 people die from some kind of flu version of the flu, pneumonia or whatever those conditions may be. Quite a number of people die every year. And so now what I'm saying, though, is what I'm really interested in is a long-term consequence of the actions that we are now subjected to, or the rules we're subjected to. How many of these rules will stay in place and how many will be withdrawn? My suspicion is There will be a version of this lockdown or wealth extraction for the sake of the health of all these toxic, we're all toxic beings anyway because we breathe CO2. You CO2 freaks out there. Your world climate thing. The climate is changing because of the sun, because of conditions and other toxic conditions, but certainly CO2 that you and I breathe out is not the culprit for the change in climate. Okay, that's another story. I'm quite upset with this sort of myopic view of the world, that there is so much clarity around this, that this still has to be an issue. That's not to say we're not faced with monumental environmental conditions, but this is uh, the part of it, the part of the climate change issues that is human made is number one, nuclear. And I think nuclear is an aspect of this virus that we understand, that we are confronted with now, this affliction that we have. There is similarity to some kind of radiation poisoning in this. And we don't really know because nobody's interested in looking into this and testing, because it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest industry for the last 70, 80 years. Nuclear technology has made more money for certain entities than any other business, more than oil, more than industrial military complex. Of course, they're involved in it, but this is a huge industry which will not go away just because we don't, just because we know it's so lethal and deadly to all existence on life on this planet. Fukushima is ongoing. So this is operative. The idea of the destruction that is occurring has been diverted. Our attention has been diverted again to something that may or may not be happening on the level that they say, but it's coming from somewhere else than what we think where it's coming from. That's my conclusion. And I think the nuclear pollution that has been going on for the last 70, 80 years since they've been testing, and primarily now the plants that are leaking and hemorrhaging everywhere, this is a cover that could easily, this virus thing could be a cover, in my opinion anyway, that is covering up the nuclear pollution that is just brutalizing all life on this planet in some form or other. So yeah, people are gonna die. People are gonna die, but it's not for the reason that they say they are. Anyway, these are some thoughts. And my underlying point again is that the homogenization that has been accomplished, as Daddy Bush said, the New World Order, this is very disturbing to me, how homogenized all of cultures have become across the board. And what is also quite homogenous is a level of tyranny that is being, in the West at least for now, that is not being recognized. It's not being recognized the same way people in Germany didn't recognize the path that they were going on when they were voting for this psychopath who had understood through mechanisms. Bernays was, I think is Bernays or Bernays, is that like the sauce? The guy who did the promotional stuff for Goebbels. They had clearly understood how to manipulate a population into submission and compliance. And what indicates this to me is the homogeneity of response and reaction. So the last bastion of hope, that as I see it, is to exercise this phenomenal aspect within us called a conscience, and especially people that have a certain calling and have an ability, a talent, whatever that might be. That talent is meaningless unless it's rooted in conscience. So the art may be brilliant, but it's meaningless to the existence of anyone. Is that a butterfly? There's a butterfly, a monarch butterfly. Middle of, it's like 2 or 3 degrees outside. How could that be? Wow, floating outside my window. Thank you. This homogeneity is from where I'm standing, for what I understand, this is an indicator of danger, Will Robinson. Danger, Will Robinson. Shock market analysis. on March, what's today? March the 17th. March the 17th. All right.